Good afternoon, Peter Goertz. Let's talk about murderers and abusers. And I want to put both of those terms in quotes because, in my opinion, we do not want to see these people who are human beings in a one-dimensional way. That does not serve them or any of us to see, quote, murderers and, quote, abusers as one-dimensional people. Now, of course, there's no excuse for murder, there's no excuse for abuse, but we want to put things in perspective. Things in general happen for a reason, not out of the clear blue sky, and these people are human beings. Now, if you're a psychiatrist long enough, you're going to encounter people who've killed people. So they're going to tell you, I remember one gentleman in the emergency room once telling me on the side, the conversation wasn't even about that, but there was something that reminded him, and he told me, I killed a prostitute years ago. And that's going to happen to you if you're a psychiatrist long enough. You're going to encounter people who've killed people, people who've abused people. And by the way, if the abuse or the killing was in the past, if it's not regarding minors, if, let's say, with that gentleman, he killed a prostitute who was not a minor in the past, or elderly, or someone who could not take care of themselves, if this happened years ago, then there's no legal aspect from our perspective. We do not have to report the patient to the authorities. We do not have to take any action as far as legalities if this happened years ago. So again, you're going to encounter people like this. And for example, you could encounter someone who has made their living by killing people. And this is something that actually happens. People do make a living by killing other people. And things are not black and white. They may be okay with making a living like that, at least to an extent. But let's say if there's a certain situation and they're killing someone and there are people watching them and the people watching them start screaming and are very traumatized, that may get to the person who's doing the killing psychologically, and they may have trouble with their sleep at night. They may start questioning, what am I doing? So things tend not to be black or white. Even people who make a living killing, they may have some psychological vulnerability to being in a position where they're traumatizing onlookers, for instance, and that may affect their sleep, like I just mentioned, for example. So that's one example. Another example, and this is a patient I encountered and any psychiatrist is going to encounter in the long run, is someone who's been a sexual abuser of children. And that, of course, and just like with murderers, sexual abusers of children, that brings up a lot of feelings in anybody who hears about these people before they even go to talk with the person. And we want to be careful as psychiatrists with our own feelings regarding, let's say, murderers or sexual abusers. So this gentleman was in his 50s. He had been convicted of sexual abuse of children, as far as I recall. And he was still having thoughts of abusing those children, as far as I recall. So this was not someone who, in my opinion, was ever gonna, or at least very unlikely, he was going to be very unlikely someone who's going to be rehabilitated. So some people, it's very hard to change that behavior, and sometimes, in my opinion, it's not possible even. So those people do need to be kept away from society in the long run. And I remember that gentleman, he was in a hospital, and at one point he was very angry about something. I forget what the issue was on the ward. And he went to his room and started masturbating. I hadn't realized he was doing that. I walked in for another reason and I saw him masturbating, and he had a very serious, angry expression on his face while he was masturbating, almost as if masturbating was an aggressive act, like maybe sex had been to him. So as often, or as pretty much any time there's something to look at, potentially at least, in their background. And this gentleman, the person who'd been a sexual abuser of children, he told me that he himself had been abused as a child, and he didn't even say it in a way that made it sound like he felt it had been abuse. He said that when he was a child, he had a friend who was older who did things with him and whom he had sex with. And the friend was, quote, friend, was much older. So that is something in the sexual abuse category. And he hadn't, even at that point at 53, had not accepted that was abuse. And again, if someone sexually abuses another person or abuses someone physically, in general, they themselves have been abused sexually or physically. It may not be 100% of the time, but in general, that is the case. And I'll add another category to the quote murderers and quote abusers, and that is the quote malingerers. And many psychiatrists have seen patients come to emergency rooms, for instance, saying they're suicidal because they want a place to stay or they have nothing to eat. So that's a relatively common scenario, that people want certain things and say that they're suicidal or hearing voices in order to get into a psychiatric hospital. Now, again, I think it's one-dimensional to see these people only as, quote, malingerers, because if you think about it, if someone is, quote, malingering to get into a psychiatric hospital, that tells us something about that person, because psychiatric hospitals, at least often, are not very pleasant places. You're with people who are quite troubled. There can be fights on the ward. These people can be hearing voices, suicidal, aggressive. So safety can be an issue on psychiatric wards, and then you're locked up on the ward, you can't leave. So for someone to, quote, malinger to be on a psychiatric ward may well tell us that the fact that they're malingering is telling us something about their mental state. So in a way, you could potentially say if someone is malingering, quote, malingering to get onto a psychiatric ward, they may have some serious psychological issues that are underneath them wanting to do that. Because if it's just for food or shelter, there are probably other options, and they don't have to be locked in a psychiatric ward with people who are quite troubled and where they cannot leave necessarily of their own free will. Thank you.